Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a moment or two to log on, and we'll begin shortly. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so pleased to present the Weill Cornell Medicine and New York Presbyterian Kidney and Pancreas Transplant Program, Conversations with Cornell Kidney, a 6-part virtual education series for patients, caregivers, and our transplant community. For Conversation 6, we will discuss transplant nutrition. Our guest speaker for today is Senior Dietitian Mike McDonough, and he completed his Master's of Science at Teachers College, Columbia University, and his dietetic internship at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. As part of the Weill Cornell Kidney and Pancreas program, he specializes in nutrition care, both prior to transplant and also post-transplant recovery. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Mike.
Thank you so much. I am happy to be here with you all. And so I've been a dietitian for over 6 years, and I have spent time with other specialties, but I must say that the time that I spent with kidney transplant specifically, those patients seem to be much more dedicated and much more committed to their nutrition. So I'm really happy to be here today with you guys and help you have these conversations so that you'll feel more informed and prepared for transplant. So today we'll go over some of the pre-transplant nutrition recommendations, some of the post-transplant nutrition recommendations, talk about food safety after transplant, go into a little bit of the drug-nutrient interactions after transplant, as well as the side effects that come with the medications that you're taking after transplant, and then follow up with some healthy eating basics for long-term health. And we'll have a couple of spots during the presentation for you guys to ask any questions as well. So why is pre-transplant nutrition important? When you're going into a transplant, this is a very big physical event, something that you really want to be optimized and prepared for. It's almost like you're training for a marathon, so to speak. So there's a lot of challenges that come with that while you're trying to optimize yourself for transplant. And these are just a few of the challenges that I've listed here. Some of them include a decreased appetite. Often chronic kidney patients will have a decreased appetite. Some patients will tell me that they have a decreased appetite after starting dialysis. So with a decreased appetite, there's a higher risk for not meeting your protein and your calorie needs. That's something you might come into. Food preferences. When you're experiencing chronic kidney disease, a lot of your doctors or maybe your dietitians will give you a lot of restrictions in foods that you're supposed to avoid. But what if these foods are food that you actually enjoy and some of your favorite foods? How do you navigate that? When it comes to weight, there's not a specific weight that we want you to be at transplant, but there is a range that is healthier and has better outcomes. So your doctors might tell you that they want you to gain a certain weight to optimize yourself, or lose some weight, or possibly just stay where you are. Vitamin deficiencies. So with chronic kidney disease patients, a lot of them are at higher risk for certain vitamin deficiencies, like vitamin D, for example. If you're starting dialysis, you might be losing some vitamins with the dialysis process. So these are things that you want to consider as well when you're optimizing your nutrition. We'll be checking your labs periodically as you go through the evaluation process. And so if you're having high potassium or high phosphorus levels, how do you navigate this? Are you supposed to avoid certain foods? Are you supposed to limit how much you have of certain foods? This can be tricky when you're trying to decide what can I eat. Fluid overload. So often patients will have trouble getting rid of the fluid that is on their body. And so the doctors might put them on a fluid restriction to prevent excess fluid overload. And some of these foods, like soup, for example, they could possibly be something you have to limit as a result of this. In addition, sodium restrictions might be put in place for the same reason, to better manage your fluid status. Protein loss. So often in the dialysis process, there is protein loss. And so your needs might change for how much protein we're recommending. How do you navigate this? What are some ways to get that protein? These are things that you can work with me in preparation for your transplant on. Hospitalizations. So many patients, for various reasons, they might be hospitalized while they're trying to optimize themselves for transplant. The hospitalization process can be very daunting. It's a high stress situation. Oftentimes there's a lot of procedures happening where they might restrict or tell you to not eat for a certain period of time. So these things can affect your nutrition status. And then obviously comorbidities. So if you're dealing with chronic kidney disease and other issues like maybe diabetes or hypertension, how do you manage all these situations at the same time? That can be challenging. And then this process in itself can be stressful. You can have a lot of stress that can then affect your appetite, which just puts you at a higher risk for not meeting your nutrition needs and possibly for malnutrition as well. So overall, we have certain goals when we're trying to optimize you for transplant. One, we want you to maintain or improve your nutrition status if need be, achieve and maintain a healthy weight, maintain a lean body mass, so all your body muscle, right? The more of these things are maintained, the better outcomes you're going to have post-transplant. We want to address any nutritional deficiencies. So if you have some deficiencies, we want to correct them. And if your nutrition is stable, we want to continue that. We want to stabilize that. Maintain or improve your functional status. So the better you are able to, physically move and deal with the external factors of just living in this world, the better you are post-transplant. So we want to optimize that as well. And then if you're having any complications related to kidney disease, we want to try to address them before transplant. Obviously, the hope is that with the transplant, we'll really address these issues, but we don't want there to be any complications that prevent you from optimizing your nutrition. And so overall, we just want to maximize your quality of life while you await transplant. And so post-transplant, you might ask, will you need to change your diet? So it's complicated, but the short answer is that it depends, but most likely depending on what your diet was before, you'll probably need to make at least a few changes post-transplant. If you are following a therapeutic diet for kidney disease or diabetes, then a lot of these restrictions can actually be liberalized. So for most of post-transplant patients, they're able to eat more than they were able to eat pre-transplant. You might have been avoiding certain things like sodium, protein, sugar, potassium, and phosphorus. Regarding protein, your needs for protein will actually go up post-transplant. So you'll no longer have a restriction if you had one now. And you'll most likely not need to restrict things like phosphorus as well. But for most people, limiting sodium and sugar will still be important post-transplant. And when it comes to potassium restrictions, we will be checking your labs periodically and just keeping an eye on those. And you may possibly need to restrict potassium, but it's really a case-by-case basis. Often the need for potassium restriction is related to those medications that you're taking, much less than your ability to process potassium. One of the most important topics that I discuss with post-transplant patients is food safety. All transplant patients will be on immunosuppressive medications, and so their immune system will not be as strong as it was before. Immediately following the transplant, your immune system will be at its lowest, and then gradually it'll get better, but it'll never get to the point where it was prior to the transplant. And so there's side effects that come with these immunosuppressants, and they leave you more or at a higher risk for certain infections, particularly like food poisoning. So it's very important that we practice food safety after transplant. You might have more severe symptoms than you would have had pre-transplant, and those symptoms might last for a longer period of time. And so there's 4 tenets when it comes to practicing food safety: clean, separate, cook, and chill. So meaning you want to clean your food really properly, especially your produce, your fruits and vegetables. When it comes to sprouts, like bean sprouts or alfalfa sprouts, you want to clean those and you want to cook them. So cleaning them is not enough. When it comes to animal proteins, you want to make sure you cook your meat and your fish to really safe temperatures. You guys will all get a USDA food safety booklet when you're here in the hospital post-transplant, and it'll have guidelines about what temperatures you should be cooking all your different meats to. Deli meat. Even if you're buying pre-packaged deli meat, you want to make sure that you're cooking it as well to be extra cautious regarding any sort of bacteria. And when it comes to dairy products, so milk and cheese, you want to make sure that these products are all pasteurized. So you want to double check the labels and just make sure that you're getting a pasteurized milk or a pasteurized cheese. And when it comes to eggs, you want to make sure that they're fully cooked. So no runny yolks, no sunny side up eggs, no poached eggs, no soft boiled eggs. You want to make sure that that egg yolk is solid. And then also avoid foods or sauces that are made with raw eggs, like a hollandaise sauce or maybe a Caesar dressing. So with food safety, for about the first 3 months, we're going to recommend that as much as possible, you're having food that's home cooked. So avoiding restaurants or takeout food for those first 3 months. And then up to the first year post-transplant, you want to avoid cold foods from outside restaurants like salads or cold sandwiches, tuna salad, stuff like that, just to be extra cautious. You can have those things at home, but you want to avoid them eating out for the first year. And then ideally, you'd want to avoid buffet-style restaurants forever because of the high risk with food safety at those establishments. When it comes to leftovers, in that booklet that I mentioned before, you'll get a nice table of different foods and how long we recommend that you keep them before throwing them away. But generally, it's about 3 days for all the foods. When it comes to heating up the leftovers, you want to make sure you heat them up all the way through. Ideally, you want to get a food thermometer, to just assure that you're heating things up to the right temperature. And then also you want to avoid cross-contamination. So this happens when harmful bacteria transfers from one food to another food, usually being cutting boards or utensils or things being too close to each other when you're preparing them. So that means keeping your raw meat, your raw poultry, seafood separate from the produce to avoid any cross-contamination. And some of the things you also want to consider is something like raw fish. You want to avoid that as well. So no sushi post-transplant. One suggestion that I have is keeping cutting boards designated for certain types of foods. So maybe you have a cutting board that is specifically used only for raw meat and poultry, and then a cutting board that's specifically used only for fruits and vegetables. So you might ask, what about smoked meats or lox? Are these okay? So these are not appropriate because when foods are smoked, they're not technically heated up to the appropriate temperature to make sure that there's no bacteria in there. So smoked salmon, for example, would not be recommended. What if you wanted to do cooked sushi? This is also not recommended because it's typically made on the same surface with the same hands, same gloves as the raw sushi. And so there's a small chance of cross-contamination there. If you're preparing something like this at home and you can control the environment, then it could be okay in that instance. Do you need a special fruit wash or spray in order to clean your fruits and vegetables? This is not adequate, or this is not necessary. Water is perfectly fine to wash your fresh produce with. Often these sprays might have some remnants or enzymes of fruits that we don't want you to consume. And so that's another reason to avoid any sort of special fruit wash. What about when you're going to a party, a wedding, or other social or family gatherings? Ideally, you want to avoid anything that's been sitting out for a long period of time, longer than 2 hours. Avoid anything that's had a lot of hands touching it as well. And if possible, you'd want to see if they could put your plate together prior to everybody else so that it's extra safe and you can just reheat it if it needs be. So let's take a quick break and answer any questions that you guys might have based off of what I've already talked about before we continue on.
We do have a question here, and it's one that I can understand very well. Someone is asking when can you eat sushi post-transplant?
Great question. So for sushi, the recommendation is to avoid that lifetime. The one way to kind of work around that maybe is to prepare it at home so that you're making sure that that sushi is cooked prior to eating it and preparing it. But I would not have sushi either cooked or raw outside of the home.
And someone else is asking if you can please repeat the name of the booklet to which you referred to earlier.
Yes, so that booklet is put together by the USDA, and it's called Food Safety Post-Transplant. I have it here. See, I don't know if you can see it actually, but you'll get it when you're in patient after your transplant.
I'll put it in the chat here. So it's USDA food safety post-transplant.
For transplant patients. Sorry, for transplant recipients.
And Mike, I just want to say, because I recently had to give up sushi while I was pregnant, but what I was doing was making kind of a sushi-ish cooked style at home, and it really wasn't very challenging. So if you have an itch for sushi, you can make the sushi rice and get the seaweed and then do, like Mike said, anything cooked. So you could use cooked fish, obviously well done. You can use other vegetables and really get creative. So I think there's a lot of ways to still scratch the itch if you love sushi so much, which I do as well. I just wanted to shout that out.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, when you're home, you can control the environment better. You know, how well the food is washed, how well it's cooked. Whereas when you go out to restaurants, it's harder to control.
Someone else is saying, can we take our hot food from a restaurant and heat it up immediately at home and then eat it?
So I do recommend that actually when you do start to eat out. You know, a lot of times by the time it gets home, it's cold, right? So you do want to heat it up and make sure that it is hot at the right temperature. In that first 3-month period, you want to avoid that as much as possible. Obviously, it's very difficult to do every single meal at home, but as much as possible, you want to do your meals at home for the first 3 months. But if you have a situation where you do have to get some food from a restaurant, this would be a great way to just make sure that it's at the right temperature when you get home.
And then someone else is asking, when eating meat, is medium rare permissible?
Great question. So that packet will give you more detail, but we recommend at least medium well for all meats. So medium well or higher.
And is that for life or just for the first 3 months?
That's for life, yeah. So these are things that are, we're talking about your risk factors, right? So we want to keep your risk factors as low as possible. And we want to do that for life because you're going to be on immunosuppressants for life. So that is something we recommend long term.
Okay, perfect. I think we've answered all the questions for now.
Awesome. We have an interactive bunch. That's great. All right, so we'll keep going and talk about drug-nutrient interactions. So I mentioned before that in many cases, you're going to be able to eat more options than you would before, but there are certain fruits that can counteract with your medications and possibly lead to some toxicity. And so for that reason, we want you to avoid these 5 fruits. Grapefruit, pomelo, pomegranate, starfruit, and Seville oranges. So I just wanted to add for the starfruit, really if you have any sort of kidney disease, you should probably be avoiding starfruit even pre-transplant, because what happens is that there's a neurotoxin in starfruit that the kidney actually metabolizes. So if your kidney is not functioning as well as it should, then you have a risk for having a toxicity of this neurotoxin that's in starfruit. So I recommend avoiding starfruit pre and post. But these other 4 can interact with the medications that you'll start taking after transplant. Seville orange is not very common. It's also known as a bitter orange or a sour orange. A lot of people will use it to marinate or clean meats, but it's also used in orange marmalade. So if you're a person who eats orange marmalade, double check to see what type of oranges were used in the marmalade. And if you can't tell, I would just avoid it altogether. And when it comes to grapefruit or pomegranate flavored sodas or juices, those are also things you want to avoid in addition to the whole fruit. So in addition to those fruits, you also want to avoid herbal supplements and herbal teas, as these can also counteract with your medications. And so things like ginger or turmeric in your teas can lead to some toxicities, possibly. And when I say in your teas or in your supplements, I'm talking about ginger in a very, very concentrated form. So like you're able to cook with ginger, but we just don't want you to have it in this very concentrated tea or concentrated supplement. But things like black tea, chamomile tea is okay, rooibos is okay. So you do still have options. So yeah, in general, if you're having any sort of deficiencies, a baseline like healthy diet can help to meet and address those deficiencies. But if you are taking any sort of supplement, you want to bring it into clinic so we can double check to make sure that there's no ingredients that are concerning in your supplements. So I mentioned earlier, you may need to restrict potassium in the beginning after your transplant, depending on what your labs show. This is one of the reasons. So some of the medications that you'll be taking, like Bactrim, which is an antibiotic, and Prograf, which is an anti-rejection medication, these medications can increase your potassium levels. So if your potassium levels are high, you may want to limit certain high potassium foods. I personally don't believe you need to avoid these foods 100%. What it means is that you don't want to have high doses of these foods if your potassium levels are high. Some of the foods that include potassium are potatoes, bananas, tomato sauce, oranges, orange juice, dark leafy greens like spinach, kale, Swiss chard, collard greens, milk, beans, and lentils. This says cooked dark leafy greens because you tend to have less potassium in the raw form, mostly because it's just more concentrated spinach or kale when you're cooking it than it is when you have it raw. But some other things you might not consider to be high in potassium include fish. So a lot of fish is actually high in potassium as well. So working with a dietitian to identify what foods in your diet need to be limited is really important if you're trying to manage your potassium levels. Some other complications that might come with your immunosuppression medications are higher blood sugar levels, higher cholesterol, higher blood pressure, and sometimes you might experience weight gain. Oftentimes, these medications can really increase your appetite post-transplant. So a healthy diet can help to manage any of these conditions that you might be experiencing. So as I said, a healthy diet is important for everyone, not just transplant patients, not just pre, this is for everyone, right? So anybody can benefit from a healthy diet, even if you're not experiencing diabetes or you're not trying to lose weight. So a healthy diet, as I said, can help to manage some of the complications that might come with immunosuppression medications, like the high blood pressure, the high blood sugar, high cholesterol, and possibly weight gain. So the types of foods that you want to include in a healthy diet are vegetables, fruit, whole grains and unrefined carbs, beans, lentils, legumes, chickpeas, tofu, adequate amount of lean protein. And that doesn't necessarily have to be plant-based proteins. It can also be animal-based proteins that are lean, like fish. Healthy fats, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then adequate hydration, drinking a lot of water. What does a healthy diet not include? So I don't want to say that any food should be eliminated altogether besides those 5 fruits that I mentioned in the beginning. So everything can fit into a diet in moderation, but these are some of the foods that you want to limit as much as possible. Added sugar, sweetened beverages, so juice, soda, sweetened tea, pastries, sweets, candy, sugary cereals, etc. I talked about healthy fats and non-healthy fats. So those non-healthy fats I'm referring to are saturated fats and trans fats. You can find them in fried foods, fatty meats like bacon, sausage, red meat, large portions of high-fat dairy like butter, cream, or cheese. You also want to limit processed or refined carbohydrates like white bread, white pasta, white rice, things like that. Crackers, etc. High sodium foods. So you generally want to keep a moderate to low sodium intake, and this is for life. So when you're looking at labels, it's helpful to think of a mark that you want to be below with each food that you're choosing. So any food that is higher than 300 milligrams of sodium per serving is considered a high sodium food. So double check your labels. That can be very helpful and informative. So here we have a chart, which is a little bit easier to see because you're, seeing a list of foods that you want to increase and those that you want to limit and avoid. So these are some more examples of the foods that I mentioned before. Having more of these foods on the left side is associated with a healthier diet and healthier outcomes. Give you guys a second to take a look at this chart. So you'll see not only does the type of protein make a difference, but the way that you're preparing the protein also makes a difference. So fried chicken or fish is much different than, baked fish or steamed fish or baked chicken. So be mindful of the way that you're preparing the foods as well. And then here we have a healthy eating plate that was developed by Harvard School of Public Health. It gives you a visual of how these things might look on a plate. And you'll notice here that half of this plate is fruits and vegetables. Some people might not eat on a plate. Some people might eat on a bowl. So this is just to give you a visual of how a plate could possibly look. You'll see a quarter of this plate is made up of whole grains instead of refined grains, right? And then you'll see a quarter of this plate is made up of that healthy or that lean protein. And then you'll see there as well the water. Water is key when it comes to hydration. Some people might be on a fluid restriction pre-transplant because they're on dialysis. So you will be on what we call, will encourage you to have more water and more hydration post-transplant. For most people, that's about 2 liters of fluids or more a day. That water is going to be really healthy for kidney and then maintaining your electrolyte levels as well. And you'll see here as well, when it mentions the types of veggies, the greater the variety of veggies, the better you're doing, because there's different nutrients, different benefits from each type of vegetable. So the more variety in your fruit and vegetable intake, the more of those nutrients you're getting. And then the way you prepare them obviously makes a difference. So French fries, very different from like a baked potato, but those potatoes, they do digest like a starch. So I'd put potatoes in this whole grain section.
Thanks.
Anybody have any questions?
So yes, we have quite a few questions here. Going back before to when you were discussing the teas, someone is asking, are there any herbal teas that are acceptable beyond chamomile?
So in general, I would say to bring in your teas if you are unsure, but I do say okay to things like mint tea as well, if it's just mint and there's no like ginger or anything in there. Sometimes I'll allow just lemon tea if it's just a lemon.
Okay.
But
And
things that have,
sorry.
things that have like a lot of different types of herbs in them, you want to make sure you bring those in so we can just double check them and take a look.
Perfect. So when in doubt, they should bring it in and discuss it with you or whomever they're meeting with.
Absolutely.
And then someone else is asking if you can kind of clarify what you said a little bit more about beans and lentils. That first you had mentioned about limiting it to half a cup, but you also mentioned that they were healthy. So can you just give them a little more clarity on that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So when it mentioned limiting them to half a cup, that was when we're trying to manage your potassium levels if they're high. So those foods do have a lot of potassium in them. So if you are struggling with managing your potassium, I would limit them. But post-transplant, most patients are not having an issue with high potassium later on down the line. So you do want to add these to your diet with less restriction at that point.
Mike, thanks for clarifying, because I think there is that really important fine line that pre-transplant things look a little different, and then post-transplant, right, that restriction isn't as stringent. And so it can be very confusing. Beans are very healthy, but because they're high in potassium, if you haven't had the transplant yet, you're watching those levels. So these are great questions.
Yeah. And often you'll hear people refer to the renal diet as if there's only one renal diet. These things change. So it really depends. It depends on how your labs are looking, how your kidney function is. So there's not going to be one set diet that you follow forever. It really depends on how things are going.
Yeah. And to tag onto that is also the patient's diet. So there are people who eat more plant-based, and then there's people who eat more, pescatarian. So it is really important that you're working with someone like Mike to customize and cater what your dietary needs are based on your diet and like living habits, right?
Absolutely.
Someone else is asking, do you have any opinion on using organic monk fruit juice as a sweetener for coffee or tea?
So the monk fruit juice, does it actually contain other fruits in it as well? Because I have seen monk fruit sugar used, and that has been shown to be pretty safe as far as a sweetener. I just want to make sure that we're not including any other fruits in that juice, because then if so, then it's probably not going to be a great sweetener.
But is agave safe, Mike?
Agave, I would use sparingly. It is really high in fructose, and too much fructose is not really great for the liver, actually. So if you're using it sparingly, it should be okay.
Do you have a sweetener that you would like, say, like stevia, for example, that you would recommend for patients?
Yeah, actually, I think monk has been shown to be beneficial because not only does it not provide a lot of extra calories, but it's actually good for our gut bacteria health as well. But stevia is another alternative as well. I would say between those two, those are the ones that I would usually recommend.
Thanks.
Then someone else is saying, is it better to steam or boil vegetables in order to avoid possible bacteria and preserve nutrients, or are both ways okay?
When you boil vegetables, there is a chance that you're taking out a lot of potassium and B vitamins as well. So the way between those two that preserves most of the nutrients is probably going to be steamed. You just don't want to like over steam it, obviously, but between those two, I would choose the steamed, and both would be sufficient as far as like bacteria and food safety.
Someone else is saying, I drink 6 to 8 ounces of green tea with lemon every morning. Is this okay as far as tea?
I'm glad you asked that, because green tea is not a herbal tea, but green tea does have a lot of antioxidants. But what will you be taking post-transplant? Immunosuppressants to suppress your immune system. But antioxidants, they can boost your immune system, which is not necessarily what we want to do. So what I say is you don't have to completely eliminate green tea from your diet, but I wouldn't have it every day. If you have it like once a month, that's reasonable, but it's not something you want to be having consistently.
Okay. What green cereal is okay to eat? This person likes Special K. However, they were told it's high in potassium. And which milk? Can they use whole milk?
So if you're using Special K, if that's your preference, it's okay. You do want to just double check the potassium levels on the Special K. I don't know them off the top of my head, but ideally, a low potassium food is anything lower than 200 milligrams per serving. So that might mean doing like a half a cup of the Special K to stay within that range. But yeah, you just want to double check your labels to assure. And then the other question was what type of milk? That also depends on, you know, how are your cardiac numbers? Do you have any issues with your heart health? If so, you probably want to have the less fat milk, which is like the skim, the 1 or the 2%, as opposed to the whole milk.
Okay. And speaking of milk, someone is also asking about milk substitutes like oat milk or almond milk.
Yeah, so those are great. The thing about like the plant-based milks though is that they're not all equal when it comes to the protein content. So if you're trying to use those plant-based milks as a protein source, you want to compare protein content. So I would say like soy milk is usually the highest when it comes to protein, and almond milk tends to be on the lowest end of the spectrum. And oat milk is somewhere in the middle. Ideally, you want to use things that have as few preservatives as possible, because a lot of times you run into issues with phosphorus and phosphate additives to these milks. So just double check that they don't have a lot of phosphate additives. And you'll see that in the ingredients. You'll see things like dicalcium phosphate, disodium phosphate. Look for that in the ingredient list.
Then someone else is asking, is turmeric safe in cooking? What about alcohol?
Turmeric is safe in cooking. Usually when you're cooking with these spices, it's more dispersed throughout the meal, right? So you're not like having it in a concentrated form. And then as far as alcohol, it's usually a surgeon's recommendation. The surgeons that I work with here usually say no alcohol for about 2 months. Then even after the 2 months to have it in moderation.
Okay. Is yogurt with granola okay?
If you're trying to manage blood sugars, granolas can be a little tricky because they do add a lot of sugar usually to the granolas. What I recommend as an alternative is just adding like fresh nuts that have no salt added to them, or maybe some seeds, or just some fresh fruit as well. Those usually have a much better response on our blood sugar levels after eating them, and actually can add some additional fiber to the oatmeal too, which makes it even healthier.
And then someone else is saying, on transplant blogs, there are some people that are saying no to kefir, or is it okay?
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. I would say you want to double check what type of milk they use for the kefir. If they use unpasteurized milk, I would probably avoid it. And if you're unable to confirm that, then I would just avoid it as well. But really about that pasteurization process that they use for the milk itself.
To kill all the bacteria.
Right.
Then
Because the kefir, you know, it's going to have bacteria, but it's going to have mostly what we call good bacteria. But the only concern is what type of milk did they use for that kefir?
we have another question that says, are fungi like cordyceps mushrooms okay to use and consume?
Yes, you just want to make sure you wash them really well. If you want to be even more careful, you can cook them, but you don't necessarily have to. But washing them is really important. The mushrooms, they tend to have a lot of dirt on them when you buy them fresh, and a lot of bacteria. That's where they can hide in that dirt. So you want to make sure you like wash it very thoroughly.
And then we have one last question here that says, what about wine, red or white?
So when it comes to post-transplant, same answer about the alcohol. That would be the surgeon's recommendation. And they would probably want you to wait at least 2 months before you drink those beverages. From like a long-term health perspective, there is some data that's shown that red wine has more of what we call polyphenols, and polyphenols are great for our gut bacteria. So in moderation, if you have the surgeons okay, if you're picking between those two, the red wine would be the better option.
So many great questions. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, awesome.
Everyone
Thank you,
attending
guys.
today, if more questions come through, we're going to obviously provide our contact information, and we can always get you in touch with Mike. So if you have like some very specific questions about your personal case, we can take those offline. And, you know, as we can tell, this is very customizable, and it's always dependent on the patient and what their eating habits are and what their needs are. So as Mike has explained, you're going to be working with him to work through this process, you know, pre and post transplant. So, all right, we're just going to run through our normal ending of the presentation where we're going to go over our resources, Transplant Living website, the National Kidney Foundation, Transplant Outcomes, findakidney.org, where you will learn how to potentially find a kidney donor using the microsite program, which I'll go over in the next couple slides, American Transplant Foundation. And then I wanted to add one that's not up here, which is the American Kidney Fund. They have a lot of really great relevant information. So please check out these resources. If you have any questions about anything involving the transplant process, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or one of your coordinators, and we'll be happy to help you. I'm very excited. Judith, who is not able to be here today, but she and I are launching, in support with the social workers, a virtual support group. And our first session is starting in January. And if you're interested, this is going to be for our entire transplant community, caregivers, and it's open to pre and post. And we're going to move forward with some transplant topics. But for the first one, everyone's welcome to join. We would love to see you there. It's going to be more of a conversation. So it won't be recorded, but it should be a really, really beneficial resource. And then we have the Transplant Mentor Program. So if you want to work with someone one-on-one who has been through the process and has similar interests or demographics to you, we can get you in contact with a transplant mentor. Please send us a message and we'll move forward with placing you in touch with them. And you can let us know. So the microsite program is something I go over after every conversations with Cornell Kidney, because we have patients who attend these who are pre and post. So for our pre patients who are looking for a living donor, our team can help you create a free and personalized website to help you find one. You will create this customizable site. You will be placed with a donor search coach who can help you launch this effort to try and find a donor. The microsite comes with 250 business cards, and the site can be shared with friends and family on social media. If you are interested in creating one, you can use your phone right now to self-register and scan this QR code, or you can simply email me and I'll get you set up. I have a couple of sample sites that I wanted you to see on the next slide. And this is a patient. And so as you can see on the top, there's easy ways to share your site on social media. There's a plugin to Facebook, Twitter, and email. The great thing about the microsite is if someone is interested in potentially donating or learning about donation, they can register directly through the website. They can learn about the process through the website. So the person viewing can just simply click, see if you're qualified, and that brings them to the registration form that is linked with our program. And then also if people are viewing the site and they may not be interested, but then they can learn how they can help. So there is just a lot of resources. And the nice thing is that the person who's making the site can really customize it. So adding why they need a kidney and photos to make it personal is a really nice touch. And so we're really encouraging all of our patients pre-transplant who don't have donors to make a site, because it's a free resource and there really is no harm in making it. And you have control over your site because you're the one sharing it. And this is another patient. Why they need a kidney is very clear at the bottom, and how patients and family friends can help right there. And then I want to ask you all to connect with us. So if you saw this, if you've joined this webinar, likely is that you found it on our social media or you got an email. If you can connect with us, we have a really great Facebook page. It's a wonderful transplant community. We share educational events, patient stories, news and updates, and it's just important to stay connected with your team. And so we have a YouTube channel where we have transplant educational videos. We have our Instagram and we have our Twitter, and all of the recordings of these webinars that we've done now, this is our 6th one, they're all on our website. So also check out our website if you've missed any of the recordings. And the great news is we are planning on launching this again in the new year, and we're going to just get a little bit of feedback from you if you don't mind hanging on at the end of the program. This is our website. As mentioned, it's weill-cornell-transplant.org. As you can see, we have our transplant patient stories, and you just have the resources on how to contact us and learn more about all of the processes that we've discussed. So on the last slide, we are really curious on how we can better address your needs and really utilize these webinars to the best of our ability. We want to ask you as attendees, what do you want to see more of? Did you like the frequency of this webinar? You know, we are doing these on Tuesdays and Wednesdays to accommodate people who have different dialysis schedules. What could we improve on the webinar? Do you want different speakers? Do you want a longer, shorter session? And then what topics are you interested in learning about? We covered this series. We did Introduction to Transplant, Deceased Donor Transplant, Living Donation, Post-Transplant Care, and we did medications. And now, of course, today we did nutrition. So Elise is going to set up a poll where we would ask if you could answer some of the questions and just type in the chat box if there's anything you would like to hear more on. Thank you so much. And yes, you may have a copy of the slides, and the information will be sent out shortly. We'll send out this recording.
Eliza, sorry, if I can just jump in. We also want to remind everyone, please put your feedback in the Q&A. We know that the chat is closed, but that's to protect everyone's privacy. So if you have any feedback of specific topics that you'd like to see or suggestions, please put that in the Q&A section.
Yeah, and you know, even if we restart the series and recover the topics, everything is subject to change and everything is always evolving. So in transplantation, the exciting things are that new innovations and processes are developing. And so even if we restart the series covering the same topics, I don't think it would be redundant. So please join us. Okay, new topics on post-transplant and dealing with COVID-19, navigating the world safely. Yeah, that's a really good piece because that is a new way of life and we are navigating that. And I know our post-transplant patients have to be extra cautious. So that's great feedback. And yeah, thank you so much. And also, if you have any other questions for Mike, please type it in the chat box. We're here. We appreciate the participation and all the conversation. It really makes for a vibrant presentation. Oh, a cooking class. Okay. All right. I like that idea.
Me too.
Mike, you in?
I'm in. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think, you know, the thing about post-transplant nutrition and pre-transplant nutrition is so important because you have to eat. There is no way to avoid these important things. Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much. I think we got our feedback. All right. And so, yes, to remind everyone, you're going to get an email with all this information. And please send us one if you have any questions. And we look forward to seeing you all in February. That would be the goal for the next session. Okay. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye.